It began with a silence and unsettling, political silence that rippled across Tokyo's diplomatic halls in the late 1930s. Japan's leaders realized that the world was listening to them more closely than ever before. Their armies were marching deeper into China, their alliances were shifting, and every whisper in their embassies seemed to echo all the way to Washington, Moscow, and Berlin. Behind this silence hid a fear, that someone, somewhere, might be reading their most secret messages. And from that fear emerged a machine cold, humming, and electric that the Japanese believed would finally let them speak without being overheard. They would call it the Type B machine. The world would know it as Purple. Japan's journey toward building Purple did not start overnight. For years, Japanese diplomats had depended on traditional codebooks and manual cipher systems, believing them secure. But modern espionage was no longer driven by spies in trench coats, it was driven by machines. Teleprinters, intercept stations, and radio waves had transformed intelligence gathering. As nations began encoding messages with electromechanical devices, older Japanese systems were becoming dangerously obsolete. Their earlier red cipher machine had been their pride for a time, but something felt wrong. There were subtle signs: delayed negotiations, diplomatic surprises, and enemy responses that were a little too quick. The fear crept in that red might have been compromised. The fear was correct, though Japan didn't yet know it. The United States had quietly broken red years earlier. The Japanese Foreign Ministry wasn't willing to take any chances. Engineers and cryptologists were assembled in secrecy. They needed a new device, one the West had never seen, one that would outmatch Germany's Enigma and secure Japan's diplomatic lifeline. They wanted a machine so complex that breaking it would be mathematically impossible. And so, in dimly lit research labs filled with wires, circuits, and the metallic scent of soldering tools, Purple began to take shape. Unlike the German Enigma, which relied on rotating mechanical rotors, Purple embraced a technology borrowed from telephone switching systems. It used electromechanical stepping switches, sleek, clicking components that could reroute electrical signals in thousands of unpredictable patterns. When a Japanese diplomat pressed a key, the machine sent an electric pulse into this maze of wires, scrambling it into a ciphertext letter. Each keystroke automatically shifted circuits, creating an endlessly changing encryption. Even a trained cryptanalyst could stare at the output for days without recognizing a pattern. Inside the machine was a clever twist. The Japanese divided the English alphabet into two groups, one with 6 letters, the other with 20. These groups didn't just look strange, they behaved differently. Each group traveled through its own labyrinth of circuits, switching paths in ways that made the final ciphertext extraordinarily confusing. To Japan, this dual-group system was a masterpiece. To any enemy intercepting the messages, it looked like pure chaos. By 1939, Purple machines were ready, heavy, expensive, and carefully guarded. They were shipped discreetly to Japan's embassies in Berlin, Rome, London, Washington, D.C., and beyond. Diplomats were trained to operate them with precision. A single mistake, a wrong setting, a misaligned switch could scramble a message beyond repair. But when operated correctly, Purple was smooth, elegant, and frighteningly secure. Messages that once required an hour of manual encryption could now be encoded in seconds. Japan trusted Purple completely. They believed that no foreign power possessed the mathematical insight or technical skill needed to break such a complex machine. They imagined teams of foreign cryptanalysts scratching their heads, analyzing ciphertext streams that led nowhere. In Tokyo's foreign ministry, Purple became more than a tool, it became a symbol of intelligence dominance, a kind of diplomatic armor. But across the Pacific, in Washington, Something else was happening, something Japan never anticipated. American intercept stations, scattered across the Pacific and staffed with young radio operators, had begun collecting Japanese diplomatic messages. At first glance, these new intercepts looked nothing like previous codes. The familiar patterns of the red system were gone. These new messages were colder, cleaner, more mechanical, proof that Japan had transitioned to a new cipher. The American Army Signal Intelligence Service, known simply as SIS, immediately took notice. SIS was small, underfunded, and overworked. But it possessed one secret weapon: William F. Friedman, the greatest cryptanalyst America had ever produced. Friedman was no ordinary code breaker, he was a pioneer, a man who saw patterns in chaos. Under his leadership, SIS gathered mathematicians, linguists, and brilliant young puzzle solvers, quiet geniuses who preferred chalkboards to rifles. They sat in cramped rooms filled with stacks of intercepted Japanese messages, trying to understand the logic behind this new cipher. What baffled them most was the strange behavior of some letters. Certain groups seemed to behave independently. It was as if the alphabet itself had been split apart. The Americans didn't know it yet, but they had stumbled onto Purple's dual group secret. Slowly, painstakingly, they began mapping out the structure. Day after day, they compared ciphertexts, searching for the faintest trace of consistency. Months passed. The war in Europe intensified. Japan expanded further into Asia. And in Washington, the SIS team continued staring at letters and numbers long into the night. Friedman eventually suffered a mental breakdown from the stress, but his team persisted. What they achieved next became one of the most extraordinary cryptographic victories in history. They reconstructed Purple, not just the cipher, but the entire machine without ever seeing it. Using only mathematics, intuition, and intercepted messages, the Americans built an almost perfect replica. When they ran their first test, the deciphered text emerged on paper like a ghost stepping out of the shadows. The Americans could finally read Purple. But Japan didn't know any of this. Their diplomats, confident and unaware, typed message after message believing Purple kept them invisible. They didn't realize that behind closed doors in Washington, American cryptanalysts were quietly listening, watching, and understanding everything. The stage was set for one of the greatest intelligence dramas of the war, but for now, Japan believed their machine was unbreakable. The silent war inside Washington. Long before anyone in Tokyo suspected it, a quiet, invisible war had already begun inside a single gray stone building in Washington, D.C. While Japanese diplomats confidently tapped on their Purple machines, believing their words dissolved safely into electric secrecy, another kind of machinery was humming in America, one made not of wires and switches, but of human minds. In the spring of 1940, the Army Signal Intelligence Service, tucked away behind unremarkable doors, was transforming into a battlefield where pencils, chalkboards, and raw intellect were the only weapons. The people inside, mathematicians, cryptologists, and young recruits barely out of college, had one mission: to unlock a machine they had never touched. It started gradually. American listening stations across the Pacific, from Hawaii to the Philippines, intercepted streams of encrypted Japanese diplomatic traffic. These messages, printed as long ribbons of seemingly random letters, were shipped by courier bags to Washington every day. To the untrained eye, they looked like page after page of nonsense. But to the analysts in SIS, they were fragments of an unknown language, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Each sheet of ciphertext carried a whisper of structure, and any whisper could turn into a breakthrough. Inside the cramped SIS rooms, the air was heavy with cigarette smoke, chalk dust, and the quiet shuffling of papers. Walls were covered in letter frequency charts, scribbled equations, and string lines connecting patterns across tables. There were no computers, no digital tools, no advanced machines. Everything depended on human logic and relentless patience. The Japanese believed that without physical access to purple, decoding it was impossible. They failed to imagine a room full of Americans who refused to accept the word impossible. At the center of this mental war was a group of cryptanalysts so focused that they barely noticed time passing. Some stayed at their desks past midnight, leaving only to grab coffee or stretch stiff legs. Others slept on couches or cots placed against the walls. The intercepted messages, bundled in stacks tied with string, arrived faster than the analysts could process them. Every day the pile grew taller, an intimidating reminder that Japan was communicating constantly, assuming their words drifted safely across the world unseen. One of the earliest clues appeared from a young analyst who noticed a strange behavior: certain letters in the cipher text rotated irregularly, not in a fixed pattern like older Japanese codes. The analysts realized they were not dealing with a rotor-based system like Enigma. Something else was moving inside the cipher, something stepping instead of spinning. And this clue became a spark. That spark turned into a strategy. The team created massive hand-drawn spreadsheets tracking how particular letters transformed across hundreds of intercepted messages. Weeks went by with almost no progress, but the slightest irregularity in a cipher is like a loose thread. Once you tug it, the entire cloth can begin to unravel. Slowly, they uncovered that the strange shifting patterns weren't random, they responded to hidden internal circuits. The Americans didn't know the machine used telephone stepping switches, but their analysis was leading them to the same conclusion. Word of their struggle traveled quietly through Washington. Officials knew little except that something significant might be brewing. They offered encouragement but little else. The CIS worked with limited staff, limited money, and tools so outdated that some analysts joked the Japanese machine probably cost more than their entire office. But they had something Purple didn't: the obsessive determination of people who believed that even the strongest cipher could bleed information if you squeezed hard enough. Then came the turning point. One day, an analyst noticed that 6 letters behaved differently from the rest. He couldn't explain why, but he could prove it mathematically. When he shared the finding with the team, the room hushed. It was not the discovery of a crack, it was the doorway to understanding Purple's dual group system. The Americans didn't know the alphabets were split internally, but they now knew something crucial was happening inside the machine. They began isolating these 6 letters across messages and studying how they changed. The patterns were faint, but they existed. With every passing day, the outline of Purple grew clearer. During this period, the pressure inside CIS increased to a breaking point. William Friedman, the legendary leader of American cryptology, carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Colleagues noticed him drinking coffee more frequently, working harder, sleeping less. He wanted to be the one to break Purple himself, but the constant strain wore him down. His health began deteriorating until one afternoon, overwhelmed by stress and expectations, he collapsed emotionally. Doctors insisted he take leave, and for the first time, the CIS was without its guiding star. But the team he built did not crumble. They gathered themselves, tightened their routines, and continued. If Friedman could dedicate his life to cracking ciphers, then they owed him the same dedication. As Friedman recovered in a hospital, his protégés pieced together the inner logic of the machine. The silence of their rooms deepened, the only sound was the scratching of pencils and the clicking of adding machines. Months of relentless work finally led to the idea that changed everything: the Americans decided to recreate the machine itself. They had no blueprint, no physical model, nothing except their deductions. but if they could simulate Purple's internal behavior perfectly enough to produce identical cipher text, they could reverse it. They brought in engineers, electricians, and technicians who had never worked on a cipher machine before. These technicians listened to cryptanalysts explain how the circuits must behave, then began constructing a device using telephone stepping switches, wires, and metal racks. The first version didn't work. Neither did the second. Or the third. But by the time they finished the fourth, something extraordinary happened. A newly intercepted Japanese message was fed into the homemade machine. When the output appeared on the paper roll, analysts stared in disbelief. Actual Japanese plain text was appearing clean, coherent, perfect. The room erupted. Some cried, some shouted, some simply stood frozen. They had done the impossible. They had built Purple without ever seeing Purple. This moment remained a secret locked behind classified walls, but its significance was enormous. America could now read Japan's highest-level diplomatic messages almost as soon as they were transmitted. While diplomats in Tokyo trusted their machine, thinking every click protected them, CIS analysts sat quietly in Washington, reading those same words with growing awareness of Japan's ambitions. And still, Japan had no idea. The loudest victory of the intelligence world was won in complete silence. The war of machines was no longer balanced. One side had Purple. The other had its. The day the machine began to speak. When the first decoded Purple message slid out of the American-built replica, it didn't just reveal Japan's words, it revealed their confidence. The text was calm, routine even, discussing diplomatic procedures with no hint of urgency. But the roomful of analysts who read it knew they had crossed an invisible boundary. For months they had lived inside a world of letters without meaning. Now those same letters unfolded into sentences, and sentences into strategy. It was like watching a locked door open after endless nights spent shivering outside. The Japanese machine had finally begun to speak, and Washington understood instantly that this voice could reshape the coming war. The surprising thing was how ordinary the first messages were. They weren't dramatic war plans or encoded threats. They discussed embassy budgets, personnel instructions, and minor diplomatic appointments. Some analysts felt almost disappointed. They had expected fireworks after so much labor. But the experienced hands in CIS knew this was the real win. It meant the machine worked flawlessly even on everyday traffic. And if the small things decrypted correctly, the big secrets would too. Word traveled quietly through the highest ranks of U.S. military intelligence. Generals, admirals, and policymakers were handed the translated messages under strict secrecy. They read them with the stunned realization that Japan's most trusted diplomatic channel was now transparent. The United States had effectively placed invisible ears inside every Japanese embassy around the world. And while the Japanese government believed their encrypted lines were wrapped in an impenetrable cocoon, American officials sat in Washington reading the same messages hours after they were sent. The CIS team immediately organized a strict workflow. Intercept stations transmitted encrypted Japanese traffic constantly. Runners delivered stacks of cipher text to the decoding rooms. Engineers kept the Purple replica calibrated like a living creature, adjusting switches and circuits with precision. Cryptanalysts ran the messages through, checked for errors, then forwarded the clean translations to a small group of military officers who compiled intelligence summaries. These summaries became some of the most closely guarded documents in the United States. They were so sensitive that even senior officials didn't know where they originated. What astonished Washington was the sheer candidness of Japanese diplomats. They wrote to Tokyo with alarming honesty, describing their meetings with foreign ministers, their impressions of political shifts, their private predictions. They had no idea their unfiltered observations were being read instantly by the Americans. Japan's ambassadors became unintentional informants to the very nation they were negotiating with. The United States learned how Tokyo viewed European conflicts, how Japan assessed Soviet military strength, and even how Japanese envoys interpreted American public opinion. One message, translated late at night by a bleary-eyed analyst, revealed Japan's frustration with German arrogance. Another documented Japan's nervousness about British colonies in Asia. A third captured Japan's attempt to sense whether the United States would remain neutral if war broke out in the Pacific. These diplomatic confessions, disguised as encrypted dispatches, began to form a mosaic of Japan's global intentions. Washington, for the first time, could read Japan's strategic mindset as plainly as if it were written in a newspaper. Yet, even amid the excitement, the CIS team understood the delicate balance they were handling. If Japan ever suspected that Purple had been compromised, they would shut it down instantly. So the Americans were careful, painfully careful. No action could be taken that might reveal the breakthrough. Intelligence gained from Purple had to be disguised, routed through other channels, or simply kept secret until it could be matched with safer sources. This restraint was agonizing at times. The analysts saw sensitive information plans, intentions, covered instructions but often could not act directly on it. They had learned to win quietly and suffer silently. As the months progressed, the messages grew darker. Japan's diplomatic tone shifted. Conversations with Germany became more frequent and more intense. Reports from Tokyo hinted at deepening military ambitions. American analysts, reading these exchanges, felt the tension rising between the lines. Japan was not simply observing global events, it was preparing for something. The Americans could sense the storm forming long before the diplomats admitted it in words. By mid-1941, Purple messages revealed Japan's growing distrust of America. Tokyo instructed its envoys to analyze American industrial readiness, naval capacity, and political divisions. Diplomatic chatter hinted at secret negotiations with Axis powers, and Japanese ambassadors expressed openly that war with the United States might be unavoidable if Washington continued to oppose Japanese expansion. These weren't explicit declarations, but the mood was shifting like the air before a thunderclap. Meanwhile, inside CIS, the human cost of this intelligence war was becoming apparent. Analysts lived in a world of constant pressure, knowing their work carried consequences far beyond their narrow rooms. Some aged visibly within months. Others developed insomnia. The weight of reading Japan's private communications messages that held clues to the future of millions was heavy. And yet, there was a strange sense of unity among them. They were no longer solving puzzles for curiosity's sake, they were safeguarding a nation that still didn't know how close danger was. Tension reached a new height when Japanese diplomats began receiving increasingly encrypted instructions from Tokyo. These instructions weren't typical administrative orders. They were precise, almost surgical, telling embassies to destroy old code books, update mechanical settings, and report on American military deployments with unnerving detail. Although the Japanese never mentioned an attack openly, the tone of secrecy itself was a message. Analysts reading the translations felt an unease that spread through the entire chain of command. Each new intercept brought both clarity and confusion. Some dispatches suggested Japan still hoped for negotiations. Others hinted that Japan was simply buying time. Tokyo's orders to its envoys became more fragmented, more urgent. CIS analysts captured the pieces, but assembling them into a complete picture felt like chasing a moving shadow. One thing, however, was unmistakable: something decisive was approaching. Throughout the summer and fall of 1941, Washington's inner circles received daily Purple intelligence summaries. These reports influenced American diplomatic strategy, military preparations, and political decisions. Officials who read them felt as though they were witnessing Japan's inner mind turning slowly toward a choice that could not be reversed. They saw the Japanese government's patience thinning, its ambitions rising, its tolerance for American pressure evaporating. Still, Japan remained unaware that every encrypted message they crafted, every directive whispered from Tokyo, every response typed into their machines was being mirrored in a silent American room only hours later. They operated Purple with absolute trust. They believed in its impregnability. They never imagined the replica humming quietly in Washington, translating their secrets as easily as a teacher reading a student's essay. By November 1941, the messages grew shorter, sharper, more coded in meaning if not in cipher. The Japanese Foreign Ministry circulated instructions that felt unlike anything sent before. Analysts sensed an approaching shift, something imminent, something dangerous. They didn't know exactly what it was yet. But they could feel the ground moving. And while the Purple machine continued to chatter faithfully, time was running out for both sides. When the wires went silent. By late November 1941, the Japanese diplomatic messages pouring into the American decoding rooms carried a strange, restless rhythm. They no longer wandered through polite diplomatic observations or cautious predictions. Instead, they arrived clipped, compressed, wrapped in urgency. Analysts reading them felt like listeners overhearing a conversation spoken in tense whispers. Tokyo's instructions grew sharper: reduce communication, tighten secrecy, prepare new protocols. And through all of it, Purple continued to speak faithfully, mechanically, unaware that its every pulse was being mirrored thousands of miles away. One evening, as cold winds battered Washington's streets, an analyst named Murray, exhausted and half asleep, fed a newly intercepted message into the replica machine. He expected another routine diplomatic memo. Instead, what emerged sent a chill through the room. Tokyo was instructing its embassies to divide an upcoming message into multiple parts and decode them exactly as received, no delays, no errors. The tone was unmistakable. Something important was coming, something that needed to be delivered perfectly. The analysts passed the translation upward with a sense of foreboding. Senior officers, reading it under dim office lamps, felt their stomach tighten. Japan was preparing a final, decisive communication. The next days moved with unsettling slowness. Messages arrived in fragments carefully numbered, meticulously phrased. Each part seemed to circle around a central idea but never touch it directly, like storm clouds forming around a center no one could yet see. Analysts sat with growing tension, decoding each installment and waiting for the inevitable conclusion. In the decoding rooms, men and women leaned over their desks, biting pencils, tapping impatient fingers, the air thick with anticipation. Outside, America carried on unaware, its citizens shopping, working, and preparing for holidays, never imagining that far across the ocean, something irreversible was taking shape. Then, on December 6, 1941, the final pieces began to arrive. Each fragment that the American intercept stations captured was rushed to the decoding team like a burning coal that needed to be handled quickly before it scorched everything. Analysts fed them through the machine, watched the plain text spill out, and felt the narrative finally emerge. Japan was preparing to sever relations with the United States. The language was formal, measured, draped in diplomatic politeness, but beneath the phrasing pulsed an unmistakable message: negotiations were collapsing entirely. Analysts had been expecting signs of escalation, but the completeness of the break hit them with unexpected force. By nightfall, senior American officials held copies of the decoded communication. They gathered behind closed doors, poring over each line, whispering, pacing, questioning. Japan had crafted its message to look like a standard termination of diplomatic talks. But everyone in that room understood that nations do not throw away negotiations lightly. A rupture like this almost always hid something behind it. No one could say what, at least not yet. They only knew that time had become dangerously thin. Meanwhile, in Tokyo and its embassies, Japanese diplomats typed carefully, unaware that the very words they struggled to phrase with precision were already being read by their rivals. The secret they guarded so fiercely, their government's final diplomatic stance, was no longer secret at all. Yet American officials faced a painful limitation. Purple revealed intentions, but it did not reveal locations, targets, or military timetables. The shadow remained shapeless. The Americans could sense a blow coming, but not its direction. In CIS, the analysts worked through the night. Fatigue blurred their vision, but adrenaline kept them anchored. Every newly intercepted character was another piece of a puzzle they were desperate to solve before it was too late. Some message fragments hinted at strict timing requirements. Others emphasized that all embassies should destroy sensitive documents. To the analysts, these details felt like the tightening of a noose. But again, the exact shape of the thread remained out of reach. At dawn on December 7, the final segment of Japan's message arrived slowly, maddeningly, a few lines at a time. Analysts rushed it through the replica machine and delivered translations immediately. The completed communication was a formal diplomatic bombshell. Japan declared that negotiations could no longer continue under American conditions. Though the message avoided the word war, its meaning was unmistakable. Yet there was no mention of where or when hostilities might begin. High-ranking officials gathered again, reading the message in a tense hush. They knew something imminent was unfolding, but the absence of specifics trapped them in a moment of helpless clarity. One general reportedly slammed his fist on a table, frustrated that the truth hovered so close but remained incomplete. They had cracked the machine, mastered the cipher, peeled back layers of secrecy, and still the final piece hid behind another veil. At that very moment, across the Pacific, Japanese aircraft carriers were silently approaching Hawaii. Their pilots were preparing for takeoff. Their commanders believed absolute surprise was guaranteed. They trusted Purple. They trusted their encrypted communications. They trusted that their intentions were sealed inside wires and circuits no enemy could penetrate. They could not have been more wrong, but they did not know it. As the sun rose over Washington, analysts waited anxiously for new messages, hoping for any clue that might reveal the missing detail. But suddenly, the steady flow of Japanese diplomatic traffic halted. The wires went silent. The machine, which had spoken so reliably for months, now delivered nothing. The abrupt stillness was more alarming than any encrypted message could have been. Silence in intelligence work is rarely innocent. A few hours later, radio reports burst into Washington like a shattering glass pane. Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor. Shock spread through the corridors of power, but for analysts who had lived inside Purple's secrets, the moment was devastating in a different way. They had read the build-up, sensed the tightening plans, understood the tension. Yet they had not known where the blow would fall. They had read Japan's intentions, but intentions were not coordinates. The machine had spoken, but not loudly enough. In the aftermath, Washington re-evaluated every intercept, every decoded line, every fragment of Purple traffic. The conclusions were clear. The breakthrough had given the United States a window into Japan's diplomatic soul, but Japan's military secrets lay behind different channels. Purple had opened one door but another remained locked until later efforts cracked Japan's operational codes. Still, the significance of Purple's break never faded. It became one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of intelligence, a victory born of mathematics, persistence, and the quiet heroism of analysts working in obscurity. And though the war would rage for years afterward, the Americans entered it with an advantage Japan never imagined. The machine Japan trusted had betrayed them without ever malfunctioning. It had spoken faithfully, clearly, and consistently, just not to the side Japan intended.